You've said in there that you felt the Democratic Reform Minister had not properly interpreted your report. Do you feel he's mischaracterized your report?
He's been very selective in his reading and his quoting from the report, and that's one of the primary reasons I wanted to clear the air today, is that the compliance review talks about a lot of issues besides the problems with vouching and the problems with voter registration in terms of administrative irregularities, and it doesn't make any linkage with voter fraud.
So why do you think they're so keen on getting rid of vouching?
I don't really understand what the motivation is, but listening to the minister, he seems to think it is a real tremendous problem in terms of risk, and I don't agree.
Is there a solution other than getting rid of vouching to deal with these errors that you did find?
Yes, I think the most sensible solution is what Manitoba does, where somebody, if they have two pieces of ID, but neither of them definitively proves their residential address, then they have to sign a declaration that the address they're claiming to live at is indeed their address.
Mr. Neufeld, sorry, I don't want to cut you off. Do you finish your thoughts?
So, okay.
Okay. Well, you started getting into it in the committee. The Conservatives were asking you to give a little more evidence or examples of what those errors were, that 42%. Can you kind of talk about that now? What sort of errors you actually saw when you did your report?
The majority of errors were documentation. People just got confused. They couldn't figure out who a vouchee and who a voucher was. Sometimes they recorded that it was the mother of a son and they didn't put the full information about who it was that vouched, who it was that was being vouched for. Quite frankly, I think in a lot of cases there's an oral oath process that they both must go through, and they would administer that, and there was 20, 30 people waiting in line, and they would just take a shortcut and forget about the documentation. In some cases, they would know who it was, and they would say, it's just not worth the trouble of going through all this this administrative bureaucratic process for somebody who lives across the street from me.
How many of them are serious, quote unquote serious, as in could have been actual fraud?
Well, serious in terms of demonstrating your eligibility is that documentation had to be there. That's a requirement under the law. And that was the majority of the errors, was that the documentation wasn't complete or the documentation wasn't done at all.
What did you make of the line of questioning in the committee? I mean, at times it was quite heated, and in times the Conservatives weren't exactly very friendly to you. How did you feel?
I feel they're doing their due diligence, and I'm hoping that they'll come up with some amendments as a result of what they're hearing from people giving testimony.
You said like they were trying to pull the bill?
Either amend it or pull it.
You said it would be more than 100,000 people could be disenfranchised because we would not use the VIC card anymore. Do you have any idea of how much more it could be?
According to Elections Canada, their estimate is that 400,000 people used the VIC card for proof of address at the last election. It was sent to a limited number of people. It was used for students, Aboriginal on reserve, and long-term care facilities. If those 400,000 people cannot use the VIC card to prove address, what's their option to be? There's no ability to vouch according to C-23, and so they're disfranchised. Perhaps with a really rigorous advertising campaign, some of them will get two pieces of ID, but I'm told that we get 3,000 marketing messages a day as average citizens in this country. I'm not sure how much advertising it's going to take to convince somebody to go and get a bank statement from the bank when they get them electronically.
So you talked a lot about vouching, but what about VIC card? Should they still be used, in your sense?
Absolutely. I think the VIC card is a valid piece of ID, and we used it in British Columbia, and there was never any problems or complaints about it.
What are the potential numbers, though? If we don't have vouching, if we can't use these voter ID cards as identification, what are the potential numbers in your mind in the next election of people who would like to vote who won't be allowed to?
400,000 people who were allowed to use the VIC card last time would not be allowed to use it this time. 120,000 people who were allowed to vouch last time would not be allowed to vouch the next time. To me, that math is 520,000 people. Now, some of them may, with a really vigorous advertising campaign, get the ID they need. But I'd say generously, you might get half of those people to show up with ID. So you're looking at least 250,000 people who won't be able to vote.
And should that be of concern to everybody in Canada?
I think so. This is a fundamental right. It's guaranteed by the Charter. It's guaranteed by international treaties. You have the right to vote.
How do you explain that the government want to keep for the parties the power to name those officials, at the polls, so they keep this little thing for them, but for that they don't make the correction that could maybe make vouching more safe and more acceptable to them. So they decide instead to disenfranchise voters to keep the right to name people at the polls. So.
Internationally, it's no longer considered acceptable practice to have partisans running the actual voting process. It should be abandoned. At the last election, it was less than 30% of the poll officials were appointed by the candidates that had won either first or second place in the last election. And I really hope that it would have been completely removed in Bill C-23, but it's been enhanced, and now constituency associations can appoint if the candidate can't, and the party can appoint, and additionally, the person who's supposed to be in charge can now be appointed by the party or the candidate that won the last election.
So they went further in the further direction than what you were recommending.
They did.
There was a lot of emphasis put in on the fact that some provinces don't allow vouching. Is some of those provinces not asking for address when they vote?
Some allow registration without ID. Some allow voting without ID. The comparison is not vouching or no vouching at all. It's the regime has changed. There was a time not so terribly long ago in this country where it was illegal to ask for any ID when somebody went to vote. It was considered a fundamental right. You didn't ask for ID. That only stopped in 1993.
So we don't compare apple with apple inside?
No, I think we have a fruit salad.